Now, if you just joined us, I'd like to welcome you to this Institute of Internal Auditors 60-minute session, Great Ways to Recruit, Motivate and Retain Staff, presented by Bruce Turner. Now, for those who don't know Bruce Turner retired in 2012 from his role as Chief Internal Auditor at the Australian Taxation Office, one of the largest public sector organisations in Australia. He previously had held CAE roles at Integral Energy Australia and State Rail. Bruce has over 30 years of internal audit experience in government, banking, manufacturing, transport and energy. He also has held independent audit committee roles for more than a decade in multiple organisations, including construction, state finances, health, environment, parklands, local government, infrastructure management, parliamentary services, central government and not-for-profits. Since 2012, he has written over 12 technical articles published in Australia, China, Middle East, UK, USA and globally. He's authored or co-authored 10 practical guides and white papers for IIA Global, IIA Australia and IIA Research Foundations. He's also delivered papers at 23 conferences in Australia, Asia, Europe and North America and conducted 5 audit committee training courses. He's a member of the IIA Australia Board and recent past international chairman of the IIA Global Public Sector Committee. On top of all of that, Bruce is the second person in Australia to receive Order of Australia honours associated directly with the internal audit profession. He was appointed a member of the AM of Order of Australia in 2015 in recognition of his significant service to public administration. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you here today. I'm just opening your mic. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Michael, and thank you very much for the kind introduction.
There we are. Pass control to you. Enjoy the session, everyone.
Thank you. So let's provide a warm Sydney welcome to all of the participants today. We've got participants from every state and territory in Australia, which is kind of interesting. Predominantly people on the line today are on the eastern seaboard of Australia, which is about 6 out of 10 people. We also have about 24% of the participants from New Zealand, so welcome. The remainder are sprinkled throughout Australia. We're also covering people in internal audit roles, from chief audit executives through to junior auditors. We also have a few external auditors and consultants here as well. And from an industry perspective, there are representatives from the 3 levels of government, federal, state and local. We have 45% of participants from the private sector. And we also have 8 different service provider firms represented, including 3 of the Big 4. So a big welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Angela Witzani is the current Global Chairman of the IIA Board, and Angela says that internal audit's ability to remain relevant hinges on ceaseless attention to the priorities of the organisation it serves. I just want you to plant that seed in the back of your mind. Angela says that we live in an always-on 24/7 society, with our devices keeping us continually connected, businesses are available around the clock, and fast turnaround cycles are the norm. We expect uninterrupted access to information and rapid delivery of products and services. Our world is hyper-connected and in constant motion. I think that ties in very nicely to Angela's motto for this year of her chairmanship, which is Audit Never Sleeps. What we want to cover over the next 55 minutes or so, I want to talk about some of the insights that we can get from the Common Body of Knowledge review that was undertaken last year, with publications coming out periodically over the last 12 months, including early this year. I want to touch on some recruitment strategies that could work, talk about some ideas on motivating staff, touch on competency planning towards the end, and hopefully we can take a few questions along the way, which will be fantastic. The Economic Accountant magazine published an article in about March, April this year that a global study shows Australia as a leader in internal audit. And I thought this was impressive to have that within an accounting magazine, because it actually reflected very favourably on the work that you all do. And it drew on some insights that were available from the publication Great Ways to Motivate Your Staff. Today's session is an investment in your time, so what's in it for you? I'm hoping that a few stories and facts that I can deliver, coupled with the live polling question results, will help to provide some fresh ideas and insights for each of you. I encourage you to jot down a few action points as we run through the webinar, and I'll also point you to some of the information that's available and referenced through my presentation, because it's useful to take some of that stuff back to your desk and understand how you can actually do something with that information. I had the pleasure of presenting a conference or a couple of conference sessions in Singapore last year. And one of the publications from the IIA Singapore talked about good business leaders should be a step ahead of what customers want. And the second part really resonated with me, and good auditors often need to be a step ahead of management. And I think that's where we are these days. We talked about the audit never sleeps motto that Engler has. We also need to recognise that what we're there to do is deliver value for each of the organisations we're working within. It's important for us to understand expectations of stakeholders, and 87% of executives believe reputation risk is the most important strategic risk. I'm a firm believer in the ABCs of auditing. You know, if we're attuned and we know the business and what it needs from an audit perspective, and we're balanced in our approach to provide valued insights, and we're credible, and we're regarded as credible in the eyes of the stakeholders, we're a long way to achieving our aim of delivering value. For those of you interested in reading the concept of ABCs, there's an article in the IIA magazine of December 2013. We're all aware that the core principles of auditing came out in the International Professional Practices Framework over the last 12 months. There are a couple of those core principles that I wanted to really draw out today. The first one is that the work of internal audit needs to be aligned with the strategies, objectives and risks of the organisation. And secondly, as auditors, we're expected to be insightful, proactive and future focused. And in some ways, there are a significant change for internal audit, and therefore we need to recognise that as we're looking to equip our staff. I've often heard the term, world-class auditing, and it was the vision that we established in consultation with the Commissioner, Michael DeCenzo, when I was working at the Tax Office, that we were aspiring to reflect the key elements of world-class auditing. And around the circle there, you'll see what they are. So client excellence is really around the alignment with the business, the quality of client reporting that's provided, the relationship with the external auditors, the branding of internal audit, and most importantly, the partnership that we have with the audit committee. In terms of the audit breadth, things have changed. It is a 24/7 work environment. So ICT assurance is different to what it was 10 or 15 years ago, and it also needs to cover things like cyber risks. There's increased focus on fraud management, including conflicts of interest. Governance, risk and compliance frameworks are really important. Financial stewardship, strategic risk assurance, operational audit, and the assessment of the organisational culture is something that a lot of executives expect these days. In terms of audit planning, it's about consultation, analysis and research, the risk assessment that feeds into that planning process, assurance mapping concepts, the audit workforce and competency arrangements, adaptive planning, continuous monitoring, and a blend of assurance and consulting work. When we talk about the focus on IIA strategy, it's around the core values, continuous improvement, audit process enhancement, organisational structure, co-sourcing, and I think really importantly, the vision of the internal audit function. So they're the peripheral bits around the circle there. The bit that I wanted to draw out in particular is maximising internal audit resourcing. And that's about these four elements: the recruitment and retention of good people, the development of employee skill sets to meet the needs of internal audit and the organisation, the training programs that are provided, and the flexibility of resourcing models that you might have in place. So when we reflect on world-class auditing throughout this presentation, that's what we're talking about. Now I often hear people say, well, we've been to a webinar, we've been to a conference, we've been to a seminar, we've heard it all before. but you don't often see some of these concepts that are actually applied in practice, and that's what I would encourage you to think about today. So, Michael, we've got our first polling question. Thank you. I'll throw it over to you.
So I've just opened up the poll now. So pop in a response. This poll is open for about a minute. And don't forget to click submit. And if we can get everyone to click submit, I can bring up the results instantaneously. So I'll just keep an eye on the poll. All right, I've still got half a dozen people to make a response, but I do need you to click submit, thanks. So do click submit so we can close the poll off, thanks. And there's one person who needs to click, thank you for that, closing the poll. There we are. And the results will be coming up very, very soon. So please, when you see the poll, respond straight away, thanks. And the results are coming up in 10 seconds. And here comes the results now. And you see the results there?
Thank you, Michael.
The results are yes, substantially at 15%, in some respects for 44%, no, not at all at 11%, and not assessed or unable to answer at 31%.
Thanks, Michael.
Bruce, can you hear me there?
Yes, I can. Yep. So I'll take over.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks for taking that poll. I had the good fortune of presenting a similar webinar to this to North America last month. It was a 2-hour session, so things are a little bit differently. Their response to this same question was 18% substantially, 56% in some respects, not at all was 11%, and other was 11%. So there's a couple of areas there that are a little bit different here in Australia, although I suspect that many in Australia have some elements of world-class auditing. So I would encourage you to explore that topic a little bit more because there are some powerful ways of creating the value that we need to our key stakeholders. I just want to touch on the Common Body of Knowledge, or CBOK insights, that came out this year. What I'm going to do is focus on the insights that were obtained from a global perspective, but I also have sourced some information for Australia which I want to provide as well. Now, CBOK is the largest ongoing study of internal audit professionals in the world, with over 14,500 responses from 166 different countries when it was conducted last year. The materials that have come out of that have been highly valuable. In terms of the insights, one of the things that's really important for us, even if we think we're performing exceptionally well at the moment, sometimes our impression of how we're operating can camouflage the challenges that lay ahead. So in this context, I just wanted to sort of say, are we able to see the forest for the trees or the giraffe amongst the trees? And it's just a good way to sort of think, well, okay, we can't always see what's obvious. And that's why webinars such as this are really important. In terms of the insights, one of the things that we should all be aware of is that it's becoming harder and harder to recruit and retain staff. And many chief audit executives have that same dilemma. The other thing that's really interesting is that I was reading a publication that came out of McKinsey recently. And in the publication called No Ordinary Disruption, the authors suggested that compared to the Industrial Revolution, change is happening now 10 times faster and at 300 times the scale, or roughly 3,000 times the impact. And it's really interesting to put that in the perspective of how we as internal auditors operate, because changes are afoot. Changes in respect to generations, in respect to the ratio of women in the audit workforce, in terms of engagement and the expectations, in terms of the alignment with the business, and in terms of the way we track ourselves. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next few minutes in terms of this particular section. It's really interesting to understand from the CBOC data that 31% of baby boomers in Australia are expected to retire in the next 5 years, which is a fair bit more than the global average. If you then layer in with that 70% of baby boomers have over 15 years of audit experience, it can be a big challenge. So if you're in an audit leadership role or you're Chief Audit Executive, it's something you need to be tracking and putting in place some appropriate strategies. The other element of generational change is around the millennials. And just half of the millennials in Australia expect to stay in the internal audit profession, which is substantially less than the global average of 77%. And when we later into that millennials now hold nearly half of all of the internal audit roles and a small proportion of CAE roles, there's going to be interesting times ahead. The ratio of women is also changing. You know, men are still holding the highest proportion of audit leader roles globally. You know, 7 out of 10 are in CAE roles or director or senior manager roles in internal audit. But the gender gap is closing in all but 2 regions. Interestingly, in parts of Asia, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, female auditors now represent 53% of the total. In the US, it's about 50-50. In Australia, it's 43%, but the expectations are that that's going to continue to increase over the next few years. What that means is that we need to be putting in place appropriate strategies that accommodate the needs of females. We'll touch on some of those as we move through. Engagement's another interesting area, and Australians are doing really well in terms of the consultation and analysis that they undertake in terms of their planning. You know, 100% of respondents use a risk-based methodology in one form or another, which is above the global average. 87% draw in requests from the Audit Committee, again substantially different from the global average, but we need to reflect there that not all audit shops across the world have the benefit of a Audit Committee as we have in Australia. Our requests from management, analysis of strategy and business objectives, consultation with divisional and business heads, and the previous audit plan also factor in fairly highly in the work that Chief Audit Executives and their teams undertake to produce a good quality audit plan. I just want to touch on alignment for a moment, and 62% of Australian audit departments are fully or almost fully aligned with the strategic plan of their organisation, again, which is above the global and North American averages. And 62% is pretty good, but there's a way to go. There's a way to go, particularly in moving from that almost fully aligned to fully. And for the other 38% of audit shops that are minimally aligned or not aligned or somewhat aligned, there's a bit of work to do there. It's not difficult, but it's really important to make sure that we can get that full alignment with the business strategies. Tracking, auditors are really good at understanding what their KPIs are, and we have a more refined approach to measuring the internal audit performance. The 2 most common measures used in Australia is the percentage of the audit plan that's been completed and the client satisfaction goals. And both of those are a bit above the global, and particularly the outward focus measures such as client satisfaction. What you're going to find over the next 5 or so years is that there's going to be greater use of outward focus measures. It'll be demanded by our stakeholders, audit committees, chief executives, boards, whoever we report to. And it'll be the means by which they can assess how well the audit effort is actually adding value to the business. We look at the measures that are used at the moment by Chief Audit Executives. 7 of the top 9 are currently inward focused about how we do our business rather than the bang for the buck. The other interesting thing out of the CBOC study is that balanced scorecard reporting is being used increasingly across the world. In some regions, like Australia, more so than others. And it's up from 4% in 2010 to 26% in 2015. And the expectation is that balanced scorecard reporting will continue to be used and be sought by audit committees as they see the value of KPIs being reported in a standard and balanced sort of perspective. So out of this section, there's a few consider points that I want you to ponder and take away and think more when you're at your desk with a clear mind. There are going to be resourcing challenges as generation change comes through. There will be a growing ratio of women in internal audit roles, which we need to manage. They're very talented. We need to consider the specific motivators, work-life balance, flexible working arrangements and so forth. We need to boost stakeholder engagement and research in high-level audit planning. That's development of your annual audit plan, for example. We need to drive greater alignment with organisational strategies. We're kind of getting there, but there's a way to go with some audit shops. And we also need to embrace more outward-facing KPIs for tracking the performance of internal audit. So, Michael, we're at polling question 2.
And I'm just opening the poll now. And you're popping the results in there. That's terrific. Thank you very much. And I just need 2 or 3 people to click submit. Thank you. And here comes the results. So there we go. You can see it's quite spread there, but we do have 27% yes, balanced scorecard report. And at the other spectrum, we have 32% of the respondents saying no. And then in between, we have a balanced alternate structure reporting approach. I'll hand it back to you there, Bruce.
Thank you, Michael. This is really interesting compared to the North American Government Auditors webinar last month. I'm really pleased to see that balanced scorecard reporting at 27% amongst the people on the line is well above North American Government Auditors, which were at about 6.6%. And it's also a little bit above the global statistics that I was citing a moment ago. For those of you out there who haven't used balanced scorecard reporting, I encourage you to think about it a bit more. It's a really powerful way of identifying your performance and your challenges. I find it as an audit committee chair these days to be really useful, and I certainly champion the use of balanced scorecard reporting. And if you're interested in publications, the IIA in Australia can point you to some useful ones. And I want to talk about successful recruitment strategies. For any recruitment process within internal audit, the Chief Audit Executive needs to assess whether the activity has the competencies needed to fulfil the stakeholder needs. And this is really about the future. How are we positioning ourselves to address some of those challenges that will come along down the track? How are we positioning ourselves to assess the corporate culture? How are we positioning ourselves to assess cybercrime? Compliance frameworks are certainly of interest to executives. Primary frameworks like your governance conflicts of interest are certainly of interest. And collaboration between specialist audit, risk and compliance areas takes a special person to be able to coordinate exceptionally well, and that's what we're looking for. There's some information that's come out recently that suggests that in terms of the corporate culture, 42% of audit shops are assessing corporate culture in one way or another, and 9 out of 10 CEOs and CFOs see value in internal audit assessing the corporate culture. And to do so requires different skills to what we might have had in the past. So great strategies for recruitment is going to touch on the groundwork, the reach, the engagement, the attributes and the transition. And for me, smooth onboarding of new people is the start of your retention strategies. We're all aware, particularly if you're in the public sector, the rules and regulations stuff. We're also aware that there's perceptions of corruption in recruitment, which bubbles to the surface in the government sector particularly. These rules and regulations, there are similar ones in place if you're in the private sector or not-for-profit as well. So I just wanted to share with you 5 recruitment tips. You know, when I'm looking at groundwork, there are a bunch of others that I've certainly seen beneficial, and you know, one of those is assessing stakeholder needs and expectations, aligning the audit vision to capability requirements, having a strategic competency plan, which we'll talk about later, job design and review grading. But the one that I found helped me break through the red tape, helped me break through the imposed barriers, helped me achieve the outcomes, was making sure that I built a strong working professional relationship with an internal human resources expert. So that's my tip in terms of groundwork. In terms of reach, again, there's a bunch of things that you need to do to reach the right people. You need to have a strong pool of candidates. You get that through a well-crafted job advertisement, by leveraging professional contacts, maybe by tapping somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, think about it, no guarantees, but give it a go. But for me, the one that stands out is compiling a polished and professional information pack. A recruitment starts with the information that the potential candidates get. So put a bit of effort in that and make sure that the information is meaningful, relevant and timely. When I talk about engagement, I'm thinking of things like the professional reputation of the internal audit function or the organisation, especially whether it's an employer of choice. I think about the fact that recruitment is a two-way process, and the aim of the people doing the recruitment is to sell the job to the top candidates. But the tip that I come up with here is to assess the applications quickly and engage with the candidates. Don't find excuses to let the process roll on and on without providing appropriate candidate care. So in terms of attributes, certainly we need to assess the skills and experience against the defined criteria. I always look at the candidate's potential to fill the job advertised, but also the one beyond that. So if we're bringing them in as a senior auditor or a principal auditor, do they have the potential to ultimately move into an audit supervisor or audit manager role? In terms of transition, you know, there are a lot of important things in terms of transitioning a new person into the organisation, into the team, the meet and the greet, introductions with management. Continuing professional development needs need to be defined up front. We need to establish the performance agreement and agree on the KPIs. We also need to determine the long-term mentoring needs. And the one that really stands out for me here is we need to provide a well-structured induction that helps you as the CAE or the leadership member within the staff to build a culture you want. You need the right talent mix, not just the right size staff. So out of this section, there's a few consider points. You know, build your audit brand, be an employer of choice. Recruits need to help you achieve your vision. Your pitch has got to be polished and professional. Candidates got to enhance the team culture. Ideally, they'll have the potential to fill what you've advertised as well as the job beyond that. And to ensure success, you really need to provide a comprehensive induction process. There's a bit more further reading there that you can obtain for free from the IIA website. I've got a few questions that I'm going to pick up from the chat. So Gina has said most recruiters give the excuse overqualified for attributes. I think that's an oversimplified reason for people not getting roles. The challenge, of course, for any chief audit executive or audit leader is to make sure that the person has the right mindset to fill in and take on the role and be willing to wait patiently until the promotional opportunities arise. I'm all in favour of a chief audit executive or audit leader to understand up front what the promotional expectations are or the future aspirations of any particular candidate. I've never used the excuse that someone's overqualified. I think it's a cop-out. What I'm measuring really is whether they're able to perform the job that I wanted them to perform to the best of their ability. And if we've got a problem with recruiters saying that candidates are overqualified, I suggest that we've got the opportunity there through professional advocacy to get them to respond a little bit better for internal auditors. So it's something I'm certainly willing to take up. We've also got a question from Brian Chitra in terms of balanced scorecard reporting. I think this is a topic in itself, but essentially what we're aiming to do is look at balanced scorecard reporting through several different lenses. We identify our KPIs against how we're servicing our partnership with the Audit Committee. We talk about how we're delivering value to management. We look at how we're managing our internal resourcing, and we're looking at some other elements of our management, including audit budgets and so forth, financial budgets. Now, I do have a slide which will be coming up very shortly that gives you some insights on how balanced scorecard reporting can link through from the highest level to individuals. So we'll talk about that in a moment, and that'll expand it a little bit more. Somebody's asked about expanding on the 9 measures, of which 7 are inward-looking, and that's from Jamal Kadir. So essentially, when we're talking about inward-looking measures, we're talking about measures that look at the operation, the activities of the internal audit function. Rather than, whether the stakeholders think we're doing okay, whether stakeholders think that we're adding value to the business, whether the stakeholders think that we're contributing to their objectives and the strategies more broadly of the organisation. So again, when I come to the slide in a moment about balanced scorecard reporting, I'll be able to draw that out a little bit more at that point in time. How do you encourage a demotivated internal audit staff because they are overwhelmed with work? And that's from Melissa. So I guess the idea there is that we'll move into a section in a moment about motivation, and what we need to understand there is what motivates me as a baby boomer is going to be quite different to what motivates millennials and Generation X. And we've got a few examples of that as we move through. So I'm going to continue on, and I'll take a few more questions a little later in the webinar, but I think they're really useful, and thank you very much for the people who've asked those questions. And I've just had one through, is there a definitive list of the 9 measures from Joshua? There is, and that's contained in the publication I talked about a little earlier, Great Ways to Motivate Your Staff. And again, you can access that through the IIA. So a few insights on motivating staff, which ties into one of those questions that we just had. There's a wide range of things that can influence the motivation of somebody. Life satisfaction is one we often don't give due regard for. As people grow up and mature, as they get married, as they have children, potentially they divorce, maybe they move out of home, a lot of different factors that can influence the life of somebody and therefore their motivation. As an audit leader, we need to be across what might be going on with our people. More common understanding of generational and gender differences, and we're going to touch on some of those. So, great strategies for motivating staff, and this is really about goal setting, retaining talent, equipping employees, assessing performance and treating success. And this is drawn from that publication I've touched on a couple of times, Great Ways to Motivate Your Staff. A lot more information in that. This is just a few of the tidbits that are most of interest. One of the things that I think is really important for all of us is that there needs to be that cascading from the organisation's strategic objectives through to internal audit's mission, its objectives, its vision, and ultimately every internal auditor should have goals that they can connect in terms of the internal audit function, but also the business more particularly. There's got to be that alignment. One of the ways we get that is through having an effective stakeholder relationship management approach. I'm a firm believer in having a stakeholder relationship management program in place so that you can understand who your key stakeholders are, which quadrant they fit into, and how regularly you should be making contact with them. And you then leverage that to understand their expectations and their needs. That's all about how you develop your strategies of internal audit and how you maintain the momentum in delivering your audit program. Now, here's the slide I touched on a little earlier in respect to balanced scorecard reporting. You can see along the left-hand side there that we're trying to partner with the Audit Committee, support management, manage internal audit process, management internal audit capability. And there's some examples of some common KPIs. Now, you need to tailor KPIs for your own organisation. And what you'll see here is that there are a mix of measures that are qualitative or quantitative. There is obviously, for what I was saying before, the 7 of 9 measures. When you're looking at the qualitative measures, it's really about the perception of the clients, the stakeholders, and how we're delivering against those expectations and communication channels. Now, your stakeholders are broader than your audit committee, your board, your chief executive, your senior executives. It actually includes the internal auditors, and you'll see that there is a quantitative measure there around the internal audit workforce satisfaction. So again, this aims to help you understand balanced scorecard reporting, some examples of KPIs, the type of measures they might be, and you want to boost the range of qualitative measures that you've got in here and move away from, still use the quantitative ones, but don't get tied up in that demonstrates value, because it really doesn't. Then understand which of these are applied to audit leaders, which apply to auditors across the team. Now, whether you're a large audit shop or whether you're a small audit shop, I'm a firm believer that you can apply balanced scorecard reporting, and I would encourage you to explore that. So, Michael, we have polling question 3. Thank you.
And I've just opened the poll. This is quite interesting. The responses are almost unanimous. I might bring this poll to a close. Pretty much. There we go. I'm going to close the poll and bring up the results. There we go. And as you can see, it's a combination of both of the above, 98%.
That's fantastic, and it shows that Australia webinar audience is a little more attentive than the North American, because we only got to about 92% in North America. So thank you for those responses. That gives me great confidence that people are listening and picking up on the subtleties of some of these points in the presentation, which I think is really important. I would encourage you that if you are focusing too much on one type of measure, just to have a look at that and make sure that you can get a good balance between the quantitative and the qualitative ones. So in terms of retaining talent, I've touched on the fact that there are different motivational drivers between the generations. Baby boomers like myself held a job for life, and that provided a pool of career auditors. With the significant retirement over the next 5 years or so of boomers, you're not going to have that same pool of career auditors. So how are you going to address that in terms of the mix of your internal audit team? When you couple that with the fact that Generation X and Millennials will change jobs or careers more frequently, it means that there could be a bit of a dilemma. So people management or workforce management isn't one of those things that we can start thinking about in a year or 2 or 3 when these things start happening. We need to be putting some approaches in place right now. We need to adapt our management approach so we can address the priorities of all of the different generations. We also need to make sure that the women and their priorities are considered, and they provide a lot of value. When we talk about workforce management, there are different elements of that, different layers: the recruitment, team building, management, motivation, change management, and productivity optimisation are all things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about generation change and gender change. There's a couple of examples in that Great Ways to Motivate Your Staff publication on workforce planning. One gives you some exhibits around competency planning and some good quality practical information around that as well. Some provide some information on establishing a professional development plan, which I would encourage you to have a look at as well. And these practical examples you can actually pick up and apply in your workplace. I'm a great believer in planning, not just planning your audits, but planning your workforce. Planning how you're going to deliver the strategies of the internal audit function to achieve your vision. You know, I firmly believe that, you know, whilst people focus on training programs, and training programs are really useful, they are a subset. Training programs that are a subset of professional development planning. So I want you to think about PD planning in a broader context as you move forward. It's good for internal audit function as a whole, but it's also very good for the internal auditors themselves. So we touched on a couple of times that there are differences between generations, and you know, I found this really interesting when I was doing the research for that publication. You know, I feel very comfortable in a classroom style situation to learn, and I learn best that way. And it really struck me when I was doing the research that millennials prefer this kind of thing, webinars. They like technology, they want media, and Generation X is a little in between. They like the self-directed, self-paced approach to learning. So if you're a chief audit executive, you're an audit leader, or you're an auditor, you need to recognise that we're all different in how we want to learn, and therefore one approach isn't going to satisfy everybody. So we need to be a little bit more creative there than what we might have been in the past. What's also really interesting is that when we're assessing performance, the younger generations want more immediate feedback. I'll talk about feedback and learning loops in a moment. And there's a greater focus on the outcomes-based work. You know, not the number of hours people spend at the desk, but how are they actually delivering the outcomes of internal audit. And again, I've touched on before, the contribution of internal auditors should flow through and connect with the KPIs of the department within that balanced scorecard reporting approach. So again, outward-focused measures are really important. So when we talk about feedback and learning loops that need to be a little quicker than what they are in my day, in my day, you know, we used to get a performance assessment every 12 months. Coming from a banking sector, it was very routine and very accepted. It kind of moved from 12 months to twice a year, so every 6 months we would have a performance feedback discussion. These days, you know, more timely feedback is really about the sorts of things I've got on the screen here, you know, where the leaders can have 360-degree conversations. They can have 360-degree surveys that influence those conversations. There are fireside chats where you might sit down for a quarter of an hour with people within your team. Skip-level interviews, so, you know, look at talking directly with some people down in the structure if you've got a medium or large size team. Coaching and mentoring is really powerful, and I know that across the country there are some IIA chapters that offer the mentoring approach, and it's a really powerful way for learning, and I would encourage that. So a number of different ways that you can provide more timely feedback, and this is discussed more fully in that publication. It's just good to know that that sort of stuff is available. And what's also really interesting is how we treat success. And we need to recognise that compensation alone provides limited motivation. You know, intrinsic rewards, and particularly in those people in government jobs, public sector jobs, not-for-profit jobs, you know, what motivates you is different to some of the folk that work in different organisations. It's a recognition that we might get in front of peers, or it might be the opportunity to participate in decision-making, discretion in how we do our work, or the challenges of the work we get. It could be the stability the mentoring opportunities we might have, a whole bunch of things there that don't cost anything that can help to motivate people. Lots of creative and fun ways that you can increase employee engagement. I've got a few examples that we'll touch on in this slide here. So employee engagement is around a number of different elements, the communication that we have at all different levels, the reward systems, team building activities. You know, what can we do to help a charity? Let's go and pack some Christmas hampers, for example. Was a really powerful way we had at tax office with my team at one stage. Building the organisational culture, the professional culture that you really, really want. Leadership development opportunities as well, and how we invest in the development of our good people. So a few consider points that come out of this particular section of the webinar. I encourage everyone, if you don't have a strategic stakeholder relationship program or haven't really heard about it, have a look at it. Really powerful. It's been picked up by a number of organisations. It's not just something for internal audit, it's something for organisations. And if you look at the New South Wales Audit Office, they have a governance lighthouse, and one of the key elements within that is about stakeholder relationship management. Goals of auditors and the organisational strategy, I emphasised that already. Talent management strategy, make sure you develop one. Have a workforce plan. Make sure you've got a professional development plan. Again, whether you've got 1, 2, 3 people or you've got 20 or 50, these are all scalable, these options. Balanced scorecard reporting I've talked about, and a link to internal auditors. Constant feedback and learning loops. What works for your auditors? What's their generation? How do they like you to communicate with them? And the employee engagement model. Look at what's relevant for your particular internal audit operation and make sure you tailor that accordingly. So again, I really encourage you, if you haven't had a look at the Great Ways to Motivate Your Staff publication, it's a really useful piece of work. It includes practical examples and couples that with some of the CBOC insights that come from that data analysis. So Michael, we've got polling question 4 now, thank you.
And I've just opened the poll. Now, on this particular poll, you can actually respond to multiple answers there. So tick more than one if you'd like to or want to. So you can tick as many as you like, and then just click submit so those results will go through. And I just need one person to click submit, thanks. There we are, thanks for that. And I'll close the poll, and here comes the results. Now, kind of interesting, stakeholder relationship planning is 63%, talent management strategies is 52%, employee engagement model is 56%, workforce planning is the lowest at 35%, professional development planning is at 60%, and balanced scorecard reporting at 59%. Passing back to you there, Bruce.
Thanks, Michael. The reason I've included this polling question is that often we have a session like this and we can go away a little bit empty because in 1 hour where you're covering a very broad topic, you can't get into detail on these sorts of things, which I think are really, really useful. So what I wanted to do with this is feed that back to our experts in the training area of IIA-Australia so that they can put this into their melting pot of what they might have webinars or other seminars on in the future. What's really interesting, and I like the comparison with the North Americans, is that the 63% who are interested in stakeholder relationship planning amongst this webinar compared to 39% with North America. Not a great divergence with the other numbers, so very similar there. A slight increase on balanced scorecard reporting in Australia at 59% compared to 50% in North America. So it's always interesting to gauge how we think we're going and what we're interested in terms of professional topics with our peers in other countries. So thanks for providing those insights, and I'll encourage the IIA to think about what they might be able to do in those areas. Now, competency planning is a really big topic, but I've just got a few slides in here which I'm going to share with you. Now, competency planning, in my perspective, is the guiding vision, reasonable oversight, explicit direction, applied competency, tailored monitoring. And there's a publication, it's focused on the public sector, but it's equally relevant for people in the not-for-profit or private sector in terms of the concepts that they've got in there. There are different characteristics that apply to the public sector, but in terms of competency planning, the fundamentals aren't that different. Okay, this is the 12-step process that's available within the publication, and it sort of runs through and it provides a number of distinct steps that you should be able to apply in terms of the competency planning for your particular organisation. I'm jumping over this topic because I want to get to some questions from the webinar participants. Establish the internal audit vision and align to capability requirements. Establish your competency plan and align that to your audit plan. Implement strategies to close gaps between competency required and available. Provide progress reports to the audit committee and a report on staff profile. I want to pick up the last one. One of the things that I'm really keen to see as an audit committee chair is, you know, who are we relying on in terms of producing the good quality work that comes to the audit committee? Tell me a bit about your people. What are their qualifications? You know, what are their professional certifications? What are their years of audit experience? What are their years of business experience? And a staff profile that encapsulates all of that is really, really useful. And that also provides us with insights as an audit committee about the eyes and ears that we're relying on in terms of the internal audit function and the reporting that's provided. I think once you have your competency plan established, it's really important also to provide periodic reports to your audit committee in terms of how you are investing in the development of your internal audit team. So they're the couple of key messages that I wanted to touch on in this particular section. And in terms of competency, these bits here come from that public sector publication. Useful, and you can relate some of these through to the private sector as well. So that's a publication that I'm encouraging you to have a look at. So I just want to recap on some of those things we've been talking about for the last 50-odd minutes. Recruitment is about the groundwork, the reach, the engagement, the attributes and the transition. Motivation is about the goal setting, retaining talent, equipping employees, assessing performance and treating success. Retaining staff is about the guiding vision, reasonable oversight, explicit direction, applied competency and tailored monitoring. And each of those you'll find that there are incremental and interrelated steps that will help you build the most professional internal audit function that adds true value to the organisation. So we've got time for some more questions, and I've got a few coming through here. Good question from Max Alves. How would you differentiate knowledge versus qualification when recruiting for internal audit? Good question, and I think it goes back to you know, what we need within the internal audit function. So you will have defined very clearly the competencies you expect in the internal audit role that you've advertised. As an audit leader, you also need to be looking at their fit within your team. How are they going to help you build the professional culture that you're aiming to achieve? So is knowledge more important than qualifications? I think both of them are equally balanced. It depends on where you are in terms of achieving the maturity within your organisation. And I think there's another element that comes into that in terms of, if they are professional internal auditors, what certifications have they got? Have they got CIA or CGAP or one of the other modules that you have through the IIA? If they're an IT auditor, do they have ISACA through the CISA certifications? So I think there's a blend of knowledge and qualifications, and I think the thing that really makes the difference is the attitude of the people. And sometimes you can err on the side of potential rather than, people who've done the same job 30 times over for the last 30 years. So good question, and I think you need to rely on the assessment that you've undertaken of your capability needs within your team. So Raj Pendi has asked, what aptitude has been found to be more suitable for employing early career auditors? And I think it's really about their ability to learn, their ability to get in and pilot the helicopter. Maybe not being able to do it today, but certainly have the nous to pick up on those experienced folk around them to be able to learn quickly, to take on fairly complex ideas in some organisations, but be challenging as well. Just because something's always been done a particular way doesn't mean to say that that's the only way it can be done. So the creativity, the innovation is something that can be quite useful. And people who are willing to invest in their own growth and development, I think, is really important as well. Now, Michael, I'm conscious that we're just coming up to the closeout time of 2 o'clock. I'm just going to hand back over to you, my friend.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Bruce, for presenting today. Really great to have you here. Great to have your insight. And thank you, everyone, for coming along today and contributing, responding to the polls, and popping your questions into the chat box. That's exactly where we like these sessions to be, as interactive as possible. And when you close the session down by clicking the X in the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's a feedback form that pops open. Please take the time to fill it in. Great feedback for Bruce, and also great feedback for the Institute of Internal Auditors. Just keeping an eye on the chat box to see if there are any other questions coming through. Paul's popped through a question there, Bruce. Can a copy of the PDF version of the slides be shared with the attendees today?
Certainly. I'm very happy for that to happen.
Okay, so I'll send a post-session email, everyone, so do keep an eye out for that email. It will come through with a PDF version of the slides. It will come through. All right, a few more thanks coming through. I will bring the session to a close. Bruce, once again, thank you very much for coming along today. It was great to have you here. Thanks, everyone. I certainly look forward to seeing you in future Institute of Internal Auditor webinars. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, Michael.